I want you to pause and imagine something for me. Imagine a survival horror game based around mountain climbing. You've got limited supplies and you have to carefully manage and plan out everything you do because you're alone in a remote location and nobody can come and help you. The thin air makes you hallucinate and you start seeing monsters and you don't know what's real and what isn't. You're just trapped on a barren mountainside where one slight mistake means falling to your death with nothing but your deteriorating psyche and your personal demons. You're alone and everything trying to kill you. I want you to imagine that game. And I want you to keep imagining it, because Cursed Mountain is not that game. It's advertised as that game, but it isn't. By the way, you're not going to see a ton of variety in my footage for this one, because I didn't decide that I was going to review this until I was almost finished with it. There's no level select option, and no way in hell am I playing through this whole game again. You play as Eric Simmons, a world-famous mountain climber who gets called to Chomolungma, a mountain in the Himalayas. A Buddhist offset of people called the Sherpas live around the base of the mountain and believe that Chomolungma is the home to an all-powerful goddess. Their beliefs are so strong that they've prevented anybody from making it to the summit. Eric's brother Frank has gone missing on the mountain, and Eric has been called in to go find him. You get to the village at the bottom of the mountain and find the place completely deserted aside from the restless spirits of the damned who crave flesh and forever hunger. But luckily, a monk named Todpa comes in and teaches you how to use the third eye, an ancient Buddhist technique that allows the user to see and battle earthbound spirits. And apparently it only takes about 12 seconds to learn this ability.
Try now. Try hard. You can do this. Impossible. It works.
Cursed Mountain is one of those stories where the entire story is the main character figuring out what happened before he got there. In this 8-hour-long game that is supposedly about mountain climbing, you don't actually start climbing the mountain until about 5 hours in. The first 6 levels are you wandering through 3 abandoned villages and 2 abandoned monasteries trying to find someone who knows jack about Frank. In other words, pretty much nothing happens through the entire first half of the game. When your story is about as slowly paced as All-Star Batman and Robin, you know you've got problems. Then again, that implies Asbar has a story to speak of. Forget I said anything. But somehow, in despite of this story being extremely slowly paced, by the end of level 2 you know pretty much everything that happened. Frank was hired by a guy named Bennett to go up the mountain and retrieve the Terma, a magical doohickey that's rumored to have the secret to immortality. Frank was supposed to do some rituals before he could climb the sacred mountain, he screwed them up, and the goddess got pissy and cursed the mountain. That's the entire story, and you're told all of this by level 2. The entire rest of the game is just adding pointless extra details onto that story. The rituals got screwed up because the priestess performing them fell in love with Frank's climbing partner. Okay, what did that add to the story? Bennett is actually a demon. Okay, I immediately beat him up and he apparently stayed dead, so what does that twist add? You even find out what happened to Frank halfway through the game. He opened the magic artifact and is now trapped in the limbo between life, afterlife, and reincarnation. So it's not like you're in suspense trying to find him before he dies, because the guy is literally just waiting for you to show up. The game is built around a story that is fully explained by the halfway point. The game has 2 major problems with it, and the first one is that it's freaking boring. All this game is, you walk through the level until ghosts show up, you beat them up, and then you move on. Sometimes you'll have to wander through the level looking for something to unlock the barricade that's stopping you from moving forward, but pretty much the entire game is just walking through a linear level, fighting the enemies that spawn along the way. There are 2 occasions where you have to use the third eye to walk around invisible obstacles, and 4 times where you start taking damage every second until you find and break some seals, and that's the most you get in terms of variety. You get 4 different weapons over the course of the game to fight the ghosts with. All 4 weapons function the same in melee, the only difference between them is what they do in the third eye mode. The first weapon you get is the Kartrika, which symbolizes cutting through obstacles. Then there's the Kilo, which symbolizes the severing of the 3 root poisons of ignorance, desire, and hatred. And this weapon symbolizes that one lives by the code of the martial arts, and never fights unless someone else starts. They're both basic projectile weapons. The Kila just takes longer to fire between shots. And then there's the Leg Pa, which symbolizes dexterity at performing the 4 powerful activities of, screw it, it one-shot kills flying enemies and is so finicky that you will not use it for anything else. And then there's the Corlo, which you will never use because it has a shotgun scatter effect, and the pellets might tickle ghosts, near as I can tell, I don't know. What's funny is that reading the descriptions, the Corlo should be the most badass weapon in the game. It's a wrath wheel that is used to subjugate, imprison, or destroy malevolent demons. The Wrath Wheel that subjugates demons is far and away the worst weapon in the game. There are 3 kinds of enemies in the game. The most common enemies are the ghosts that walk. They slowly shamble towards you and die in about 3 hits, unless you're stupid and using the Corlo. Then there are the flying enemies that throw projectiles at you, but unless you're stupid and not using the lag paw, they die in one hit. Then late in the game you fight the ghosts of other mountain climbers who are slightly faster than the walking ghosts and sometimes use ranged attacks, but they're still easy as crap to kill because they die in 3 or 4 hits. So since enemies have so little variety to them, every single fight in the game goes like this. You stand completely still, controls are so stiff that moving in combat is a waste of time, and you shoot the enemies as they walk directly at you. Your weapons knock enemies back, so one solid shot gets a baddie out of your face. You focus on one enemy at a time so the enemies can't gang up on you, and you repeat until the entire group is dead. Then you walk about 50 feet and do it all again. But there's one thing that pushes the combat over the edge into being way too easy. Once an enemy is about to die, a bright red circle appears on their chest. At this point, you can either attack them again to kill them, or aim at them, press A, and do a few Wii Remote motions to perform a kindness ritual, which restores your health. The problem is that performing a kindness ritual is dirt easy. The game is very forgiving when reading the motions, and time stops so the other enemies can't attack you. There's no reason at all not to do a kindness ritual. I think it's actually easier than just straight up killing the enemy. So every enemy you kill restores your health. Combat is ridiculously easy, A, because the enemies are so easy to kill, and B, your health is constantly being replenished. Although while doing the kindness ritual, I never did figure out the correct way to swing the nunchuck when it tells you to swing it forward. The motions are finicky, but the game doesn't punish you for screwing them up unless you just suck really hard at them. The levels are very tight. Unless you're wandering around an abandoned village, each level is pretty much just a hallway, and even if you are in a village, there's typically only one path you can go at a time without backtracking. The thing that's a persistent pain in the ass is that the levels are full of invisible walls rather than having clear boundaries. Navigating levels quickly gets annoying because you have to experiment to figure out where you can go, and the tedious navigation isn't helped by your slow-ass movement speed. Although I will give the game credit for one thing. The atmosphere of the levels is fantastic. The levels are designed to look like realistic locations, and there's no music. It's just you alone with the wind and the roaring of ghosts. So there are times when you get really immersed in the game and almost feel like you're wandering around the locales yourself. It's a very creepy atmosphere on the occasions that you get sucked into it. The atmosphere is pretty much the only thing you'll remember about this game because it's the one thing that the game does well. One last nitpick before we get into the biggest problem with the game. It's a pet peeve of mine because it just screams of careless design in my opinion. The game gives you 10 inventory slots on the pause menu and it is physically impossible to fill more than 5 of them. 6 at the absolute most in case I'm remembering wrong. There are only 2 inventory items in the entire game that you actually use. Incense sticks, which recover health, and much later, oxygen tanks. The only other items that ever get added to your inventory are plot MacGuffins you don't actually use, like the pendant or the ceremonial bell. There aren't any optional items or tools to pick up that ever get added there. The game is just that bare bones. There are also these weird little red statues of one-breasted goddesses hidden throughout the levels, and I honest to God have no idea what these things do. I read the instruction booklet cover to cover and it doesn't mention them once. They don't get added to your inventory. They don't power you up in combat. The text that appears when you find one implies that they're basically religious smart bombs to kill enemies, but there's no way to use them. So what the hell do they do? Don't know, don't care, didn't need them anyway. So by now you've probably figured out that Cursed Mountain is a pretty lousy game. The combat is boring, the story sucks, and the levels are tight and full of invisible walls. So how could this game get any worse? Well, I'll tell you. Cursed Mountain is a survival horror game, and I had to go look that up on Wikipedia to make sure, because this is the unscariest game that I have ever played. To keep my explanation of why Cursed Mountain isn't scary concise, I'm going to try doing something productive, so for all of you aspiring game developers out there, here are 10 simple rules to follow when making a survival horror game that Cursed Mountain screws up every single one. Rule 1. Do not hand out checkpoints like Halloween candy. Cursed Mountain has a tendency to give you a checkpoint before and after every decent fight, so if you die, you just respawn right at the fight that killed you. Nothing deflates tension like the thought that I can screw up as much as I want and suffer no consequences. You can get away with this in games where you can't fight the enemies and it's almost a puzzle how to get away from them, but if you plan on making me fight the monsters, the checkpoints should be a little more scarce. It might piss off some players, but it'll also make you go aw shit whenever you see enemies, and it'll make you nervous not to screw up so you have to redo everything all over again. Rule 2. Do not hand out healing items like Halloween candy. It's extremely easy to recover health from the basic enemies in a survival horror game, so I used maybe a tenth of the healing items that I picked up. The horror of entering Purgatory, a world of ghosts and demons, is deflated a little if I've got 35 magical healing Kit Kats in my back pocket. shit, why did I say that? Now I want a Kit Kat. I should be actively dreading each enemy encounter, and I'm not going to do that if I've got more health than the heavy. And you'd think having limited health would be a no-brainer in a survival horror game! It's in the damn title! Rule 3. If you're going to have projectile weapons, give them ammo! I have 4 kinds of guns that reload quickly, kill an enemy in 4 hits at most, and never run out of ammo. The enemies are slow and stuck with melee attacks, and the ones that aren't can be killed in 1 hit. Is piss-easy combat what you were going for? Give me a super powerful weapon that I can use with impunity? I'm not going to have nightmares about enemies that I can swat away with ease. On that note, Rule 4. The player should not be stronger than the enemies. This is basic common sense. You're not going to be scared of something that you're a decent match for in a fight. Slenderman, Freddy Fazbear, and the fat bastard from Outlast are all horrifying villains, and you know what they have in common? They can basically one-shot kill you, and the most you can do is shut a door in their face and run in the other direction. Sometimes not even that. The enemies in Cursed Mountain are so easy to put down that when enemies spawn, the first 4 words that pop into my head are "come at me, bro," exclusively in that order. The first 4 words that should come to mind are "fuck," exclusively in that order. Rule 5. Creepy environments are only creepy if something creepy happens in them. Cursed Mountain is a major fan of creepy abandoned X for its level designs, but here's the problem. A creepy abandoned house is only scary because your mind races about why it's abandoned, and every noise you hear you wonder what the hell is causing it. After 2 entire levels of abandoned buildings with nothing in them aside from the same ghosts you fight everywhere else, I knew the game was designed such that nothing was ever going to happen in these buildings, and after you realize that, the locales are no longer scary. Rule 6. Do not tell me when enemies are around. The game basically stops and sounds an alarm. If not that, it plays a miniature cutscene when ghosts spawn, and they always spawn in plain sight, and then you have several seconds before any of them manage to launch an attack. You'll never be caught off guard by enemies, which only further defangs any intimidation they might have had. You walk through levels without fear because you'll be warned well in advance of an enemy trying to attack you, so you know that you're in no danger. You can warn a player about enemies if you're making a game like Outlast, where the player is helpless against enemies, to set a feeling of dread and paranoia into the player, but if you insist on having combat, then I should not get a 3-second head start on every single enemy. Rule 7. Have the player character act like he's afraid of the monsters. Eric Simmons is a likable character, but he went to the Curtis Craig school of not reacting to anything that happens in the story. He conquers mountains and doesn't afraid of anything. He never acts scared of the ghost, and his reaction to every ghost and new development is, huh. That happened. It's partly the same reason I've never found the Arkham games scary. The main character isn't afraid, and I'm just a little monkey turning the levers in the main character's head, so why should I be afraid? Rule 8. Learn how resource management works. Resource management should involve a resource that's vitally important and either doesn't replenish or is replenished infrequently. It adds to the player's sense of helplessness that they've got something that will save their ass, but they're scared to use it because they might need it later. Cursed Mountain goes the exact opposite route of having a resource that you don't need much of unless you're an idiot, and is easier to find than fish in an aquarium. One of the last levels gives you an oxygen meter. Once it runs out, you start dying, and this is the only limited resource in the entire game, because using the third eye doesn't require any kind of energy. I found about 3 times the oxygen that I needed to keep the meter full at all times. The meter doesn't even go down that quickly unless you run everywhere, and there's absolutely no benefit to running aside from getting the game over quicker. It's not even hard to find the oxygen bottles because the levels are so tight and linear, and the tanks are huge. You basically trip over them. I don't think it's physically possible for them to have screwed up resource management any more than they did. Rule 9. If you're going to have psychological horror, give the player a reason to think they're hallucinating. Eric insists throughout the entire game that the ghost and his magic powers aren't real, that he's just hallucinating, but the enemies operate on such consistent and well-established rules that are explained by a monk no less, that there's no reason for you to suspect that Eric is hallucinating. It also makes the character look stupid when he keeps insisting that he's hallucinating when he obviously isn't. Most survival horror games also don't tell you exactly what the enemies are, because the most basic fear is fear of the unknown. If I know that I'm fighting ghosts and I know ghosts are easy as crap to kill, I'm not going to be scared of them. Rule 10. No cutscenes! Let's say for the sake of argument that the story demands that I fall through an ice sheet. If I fall through a sheet of ice in the middle of gameplay, it gives me the impression that I'm actually dying and it's because I did something that I'm not supposed to do, and I freak out. If I fall through an ice sheet in a cutscene, I don't get scared because I know that this is a pre-scripted, unavoidable event that is supposed to happen and beyond my control. Cursed Mountain stops for a cutscene every time something mildly interesting happens, and half the time just to show you an enemy spawning. Seriously, it breaks for a cutscene like every couple of minutes. It breaks the immersion, which disrupts the horror, assuming, of course, that there was horror to begin with, which there wasn't. Like I said, I went to Wikipedia to check for myself that this game is, in fact, a survival horror game, and while I was there, I discovered something interesting. This game was a collaboration between 16 different companies split among 14 different countries. Well, there's your problem! This is what usually happens when a game gets passed between different companies. Company 1 decides to make a survival horror game, Company 2 decides to use the game engine for a minimalistic beat-em-up or adventure game, and God knows what the other 14 companies do because someone forgets that there's an inventory to fill, someone forgets that running is supposed to attract ghosts, which the opening level tells you and it never happens, and because there's no unified leadership guiding the game, it just turns out as an amorphous blob of different games that didn't fuse properly, instead of being just one well-developed core experience. I didn't hate Cursed Mountain, but I sure as hell won't be playing it again anytime soon. The combat and enemies are so basic and never evolve that the game just becomes boring long before you get to the end, and if I haven't labored the point home enough, the game is trying to be a horror game, but it just isn't scary at all. As simple and bare bones as it is, there are times when the story grabs your interest, and the game does have its moments of engrossing atmosphere. I kind of like the boss fights, if only because your combat abilities are so limited that you feel like a normal person fighting these demons, and the game's ending has been called pretentious, but I thought it was quite moving. Halfway anyway. Through the entire game, Eric talks about how Frank is an idiot who was always competing with Eric and always felt he had something to prove. But in the last level, the disembodied voice of Frank finally gets to tell Eric off for being aware that Frank was living in his shadow and being a condescending prick anyway. It's like the company that did the ending was the only one who knew what the hell they were doing. At the end of the game, both Frank and Eric confront their personal demons, which entails just you fighting a demon, and Frank realizes what an awful person he is. You find several entries from his diary and every single one of them drills home that fact, and he decides that he's gone past the point of redemption and passes through purgatory to reincarnation, hoping to make better use of his next life. Alright, you explain it and it sounds stupid, but I thought this whole ending was genuinely emotional and pretty well done. My only problem is that Frank confronts his demons and makes peace with himself. Eric doesn't, and it just feels like a cop-out that Eric never admits to his own flaws, and he only confronts his demons by physically fighting them. You just don't get the sense that Eric, who's the protagonist, gets any character development. And that's the entire game in a nutshell. Decent ideas that were screwed up at almost every opportunity.
So, situation normal, I guess. Completely screwed up.